Welcome to Software Heresy video number 5. This video is going to be a fun one. In this one, we're going to talk about no-code reviews. And I think this one is especially fun because no-code reviews is one of the positions that I've found is most likely to make developers look at you as if you've grown a second head or a second arm or something. This is heresy of the highest order among many developers. I have my usual warning. Heresy can be uncomfortable or even a bit insulting. My goal through these talks is to present you with something that challenges some beliefs that may be deeply held by you. And when that happens, we naturally feel uncomfortable, we feel insulted. Sometimes we might even feel a bit combative. Try not to take it personally, or try not to take it too personally. I want you to take it personally enough that you will actually be engaged and thinking and considering whether I might be right or whether I actually have a point. So, no code reviews. And to talk about this topic, I want to talk about what code review processes look like in most groups, or at least in many groups. And there's certainly going to be some of you who say that's not how we do code reviews and he's wrong. Please try to stick with me and try to get the basic point I'm making rather than quibbling over small differences or perhaps even big differences between what I'm saying and how your team actually does things. So this is a timeline of the way code reviews typically work, or worked in many of the teams I've been associated with. And we have our developer, Mr. Blue, has completed some software and they've submitted it for code review. And then we have 3 other developers, Red, Purple, and Gold, who are going to review it. And what we see is kind of an asynchronous set of activities. So sometime after the submission, each of those 3 developers is going to take up the review. We don't really know how long that gap is going to be. And some of them may just submit things, and then at some point, the developer who owns the code may submit updates. They may make revisions, submit updates, submit more updates, and then finally we'll get to the finish point. So what do we note about this process? Well, the first thing I note is it's a long cycle time. And the reason it's a long cycle time is these operations are inherently asynchronous. So we don't really know, person doing blue doesn't really know when they're going to get review comments back. And it could easily be the case where that person wants review comments from the gold reviewer, but that developer has actually gone home for the day. So maybe you don't get those comments back. So inherently there's a long cycle time. And the long cycle time has a really interesting outcome. Oh, sorry, one thing to talk about first. What happens in these times in between the code review actions that the submitting developer takes? So we have something submit happens, and then there's this big chunk of time. We don't have any comments. So what do we do in those? And my assertion is that time is mostly wasted. Now you can say, okay, I did caught up on email, or I did other people's code reviews, or I don't know, I went out and took a walk, or went and had lunch. But in general, none of that time in there is moving this developer farther towards getting this piece of code finished and checked in. And that's what I mean by mostly wasted. So what you could think of is if we could compress everything to the left, this would take much less time. There's also an outcome of being in groups that have long cycle time. And this is what happens is I'm going to optimize as a developer to waste as little time as possible. And part of my optimization there is to try to make my check-ins as big as possible, or as big as I can get away with. So we see things like this, implemented a whole new repository and I fixed these 3 bugs. And that not only makes it harder to review, but perversely, being harder to review can actually be a good thing. Because if it's harder to review, it's harder for those 3 commenters to give me things that I want to change, or things that they think I should change. So I actually have to do fewer revisions. And fewer revisions, I do this less often, I waste less time. So that pushes us towards big check-ins. But from a quality perspective, that's obviously a bad thing. And from a agility perspective, it's also a bad thing. So what could we do? Well, before I talk about what we could do, I want to talk about something that we kind of missed in that first diagram. So what I was missing is now indicated in these little checked boxes. And what do each of these check boxes denote? They denote a context switch. So at each of these points, one of the developers had to switch from what they were doing to do something new. Now, it's pretty well known that every shaded section is a loss of time and a loss of context. Okay, so it takes me time to switch over to do something new, and then it takes me time to come back. What is perhaps less known is it's also possibly a loss of quality. And the loss of quality comes because when I switch back, I actually don't have a full context in my head that's as good as before I switched. So I'm working on my code, and when I switch over to do the review, and then I switch back, I don't actually have the mental state that I had before, but I may think I have that state. And that means I'm just a little more likely to have some issues. There's also a more problematic here. The 3 reviewers have a dilemma. They want to do a good job on the review, but every minute they spend on it takes time away from what they are, in big quotes, supposed to be working on. And if you look at the kind of direction management gives to most programming teams, they will say things like, code reviews are really important and you should make sure to be responsive. But there's a parenthetical phrase there that's never stated, or rarely stated, which is, as long as it doesn't get in the way of the stuff you own. And you can be pretty sure that if you do wonderful code reviews, but you are slow and you are late on the things you are working on because of that, it's unlikely that that is going to result in a great review for you, at least in most teams. So we have these 3 people who now have very messed up incentives. They'd like to do good reviews. They'd like to be timely in their response, but that actually is problematic. It makes their how they look worse. So how could we get rid of this? Or how could we improve the situation? So, and here's where the heresy comes. How about if we assign a primary person to do code reviews? So we're going to assign Mrs. Red to work with Mr. Blue for this particular feature or story, this chunk of functionality that they're working on. What does this mean? Well, first of all, it gets rid of a lot of the asynchronous nature. We now have this one person assigned, and they're assigned to be responsive. So it's more work for them, but it's fewer interruptions overall for the whole group because the other 2 developers don't have to be involved. And the cycle time becomes much better, simply because we've shrunk down those wait states considerably. But what about the code? And when I first talk about this, people just say, we're going to miss things. How can we know Mrs. Red is going to do the right thing? Or how do we know one reviewer isn't going to miss things? And that's really a fair criticism of this. So how could we move forward? How can we make this better? I've got a few ideas. So what if Mr. Blue explained the details of what was done and why to Miss Red so that she has more context about what is going on? One of the most problematic things about most code reviews is they don't give you enough context to understand what was in the mind of the developer when they were writing the code. So you don't understand what was going on in the bug they fixed, so you can't really evaluate whether the fix they made is an appropriate one. Or you don't really understand the scenario they're trying to implement, so you can't give good comments about it. So if we add something to our process up front, at the time the handoff, then that would help. That would help a lot, right? We'd get better review results from that single person. So that'd definitely be a good thing. And since it's only one person, that's not a really hard interaction to do. They can actually do it in person. Or we could roll time back a little and say Mr. Blue could discuss his plans with Miss Red ahead of time. So they could have like a little design discussion. It's like, oh, I'm going to fix this. I think I figured out what's going on. This is what I think. This is how I'm going to fix it. Great. Then when the code review comes around, it's much more of a just quick review rather than trying to understand what was done. So that would probably improve things too. Or maybe he could discuss what he did and what he was planning next in a bunch of small steps. So instead of doing these big chunk of implementation and code review at the end, let's break that up into a small series of small things and have those discussions at those small things. And that would ensure that the reviewer is always as informed as possible. And if we did that, maybe our review would be so good that we really wouldn't need the big review at the end. And many of you have probably figured out where I'm going. Congratulations, you've just invented pairing. And this is really the biggest advantage of pairing. Some people sometimes call pairing continuous code review. And not only do you get continuous code review, but there's something very much more important that happens. I'm going to talk about that now. So the problem with code reviews, as I said earlier, they take a lot of time. They have slow cycle time, and they aren't very predictable. You may think that this code review cycle is going to take an hour or 3 hours. Maybe it's going to take 3 hours. Maybe it's going to take 3 days. You don't really know up front. It interrupts people, causes the context switching loss, causes the possible quality loss. It leaves the author trying to do something useful while they're waiting for the code review to come back. And they can go and start something up new. In general, I think that's like the worst thing you should do, because then you've almost guaranteed that you've lost meaningful context switching loss. It leaves the reviewers trying to decide whether to devote time to the review or to their real work, the work that they're getting measured on. So those things I think are bad enough. There's some things that I actually think are worse. Code reviews focus on the trivial. You'll see a lot of code reviews that talk about things like naming and code formatting and those sort of things, because first, the review changes are often big, and most people do not write good descriptions of what the situation was, what change they made, and why. And that means you often don't have enough context to understand the design or the design level decisions that happened during the code review. Worse, you can't generally give feedback like, your design is a mess, please start over and do it right. Because the people you give that feedback to are the ones who are going to be doing your reviews. And the interesting thing you find is you will sometimes see this kind of feedback, but the only time you see it is when the reviewer is in some other team. So they can give you that feedback because you're not going to be reviewing their code. But in general, you can't give that kind of feedback. I would sometimes express this as the I have to work with these people problem. Also, code reviews don't help with design because you can't have the discussion at the time when designs are made. You're only having the discussion afterwards. And because you can't give feedback to go back and redesign, you don't get changes in design. And there's a little more subtle problem here. And the subtle problem is when I get to the point that I'm doing a code review, I submit it, and I think I'm done. Okay, I expect I might have to make some changes, but I expect that I'm going to make small changes. So from a mindset perspective, I'm much less open to changing things. My goal at that point is get this code checked in with the minimal amount of extra work. So the chance that I will go back and change designs, even when people give me feedback, which is rare, is pretty low. So that's why I am an advocate more for pairing approaches or tripling or mobbing approaches than for code reviews. I simply think code reviews do not give us the sort of benefit that they're asserted to give us. So that completes this bit of heresy. Thank you for your attention. I hope you'll come back for the next video.